Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Catherine Howard, the SVP of Programs at Community Vision Capital and Consulting. Just want to thank you very much for joining us today. The events of the last several months have served as a reckoning to community vision and for many in the greater CDFI world. And I know many of you are with us in response to our invitation to join an update on Community Vision's COVID response. However, we've chosen to pivot today from an overview on our work related to the COVID pandemic to curating a conversation about the urgent need to deepen our commitment as an organization and an industry to addressing the systemic issues that economically and socially oppress Black people. In this moment, we are reckoning with the fact that as an organization and an industry, we have not met the needs of the Black community in particular, and need to push ourselves to move from a model focused on charity to one that is rooted in justice. So while most of you in the audience are likely familiar with Community Vision, before we start the discussion, I want to provide a very brief background on the organization. Community Vision was started as a loan fund 33 years ago by individuals who wanted to combat racism and invest in economic justice by investing in communities of color that had been intentionally disinvested and denied access to capital through redlining and other discriminatory practices. Now, Community Vision is a multifaceted social justice organization that brings together capital in the form of lending, grant making, and new markets tax credit investments, and technical assistance and training that's focused on real estate and financial management for mission-driven organizations. We also continue to be a vehicle for individuals and institutions that wish to invest in Northern and Central California communities. So CDFIs like Community Vision were in part created as a response to a financial system that excluded and harmed communities of color, something that's true to this day. Yet, as we have been examining our decades-long record, we see that Community Vision and much of the CDFI field more broadly has treated only some of the symptoms of this financial system and hasn't done enough to treat the root cause of systemic oppression rooted in an extractive white supremacy culture. Though the world has taken a pause due to COVID-19, the pandemic of anti-Black racism is not new, continues to impact Black people economically, socially, and emotionally as it has for generations. And if we take a look at this chart, we see that the Black community is about 13% of the population of the country, but has made up a quarter of all COVID-related deaths. So this is a health crisis brought on by a virus, but exacerbated by anti-Black systems that perpetuate the oppression of the Black community. And the COVID health crisis is just one symptom of pervasive racism and one indicator of the failure of many CDFIs and community development, among others, to serve the Black community. So if we look at the financial data, such as come on the screen here, we see that the racial wealth divide has grown over 3 decades. And not just that, Black and Latino families continue to be more than twice as likely to have zero wealth when compared to white families. Many CDFIs and community development as a whole have failed to invest in effective strategies that to create economic justice. And to understand this is to understand the need to radically change the way that we do our work. At Community Vision, we're wrestling with this issue and pushing ourselves and calling for our peers to ground all of our work in systemic change and return to a focus on justice and not charity. This is a moral issue for us, and it's our duty to urgently shift the paradigm we've been operating in. If we do not do so, we feel we'll continue to be part of the problem. So, though as an organization, we will continue to focus on a wide range of issues in diverse communities across California, today we're centering a conversation specifically around how we better serve the unmet needs of the Black community. And I'm going to pause here and ask that you welcome my colleagues. We have a dynamic set of women here who will be holding this conversation. So from the Community Vision staff, Esperanza Payana, who's Director of Strategic Initiatives, Ruby Harris, Co-Director of Lending, and Kelly Ehrenfeld, who's managing real estate consultant. And we're also joined by our Community Vision board member, Carolyn Johnson, who's the executive director of the East Oakland Black Cultural Zone. So just a little ground rules. This is going to be a moderated conversation, and we'll leave time for questions and answers toward the end. You can feel free to submit any questions that you may have via the Q&A link or Q&A function within Zoom, and we will work at getting to those. So I'm going to start the conversation off by asking Esperanza if you could kick us off. And we're saying that we need to center race in our work and in this conversation. And could you talk a little bit about what that means to center race, and what does that mean both internally and externally in the context of community development?
Yes. So centering race means that you're in whatever the problem is that's being identified within the community, you're really looking at the impacts, the experience and impacts specifically within communities that are most impacted by inequity. So in this case, let's speak to the charts that you showed. For Black and Latino populations within the United States, wealth disparity continues to grow. So if we're going to have a conversation about racial wealth equity, we need to be talking about why that is and centering Black and Latino populations in that conversation. In today's conversation, when we're talking about impacts within the Black community, both COVID and also economic impacts, as well as continued impacts of systemic racism, then we need to really stick to what are the experiences specifically within the Black community without steering away from that to talk about what other communities are experiencing. So when it comes to, centering race, we're talking about centering it within community development, within the community experience, which also means centering and lifting up that voice, the voice of the community, because those are the folks, we are the people that are living this experience. So it means lifting that up, listening. But again, as we move forward in this conversation, we are speaking today about impacts within the Black community. So we are centering that.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to all just kind of have that framework of centering the voices of the community that we are looking to serve, and truly understanding, raising up Black community voices and raising up that experience, and making that the central and focal point of the conversation and the work, and understanding that the work is not going to get done in a manner that truly answers people's wants and needs and addresses individual communities' concerns if those voices and those people are not central to that conversation. So, I want to talk a little bit about how the intention of community development organizations and CDFIs changed over time, and how we're kind of talking internally about what that's looked like for community vision, and sort of how we feel that we have become part of a system that has upheld systems of racism instead of necessarily being the organization that is focused on economic justice exclusively and really centering that. So maybe you and I can talk a little bit about how things have changed for not all CDFIs, but many CDFIs over time, where we think that got us to now, and a little bit about how we're thinking about changing that. And then I'd invite our colleagues to include it in this discussion as well. So Esperanza, why don't I ask you? So what have you seen? So what have you seen in terms of, you're relatively new to the CDFI industry. You've been working in the CDFIs for maybe 4 years. What do you know about sort of the place that CDFIs came from, and what have you seen now, and what have you seen in terms of that change over time?
Yeah, so I basically was drawn to the work in recognizing the social justice framework that CDFIs were born from. CDFIs really came out of the Community Reinvestment Act and really out of the Civil Rights Act and movement. And they were created as an intersection between social justice and finance, as a mechanism to find creative and flexible ways of utilizing many forms of capital in order to ensure access to capital and resources within communities, again, most systemically impacted within the United States. So as in my own profession in food and farm systems, was looking for ways to strengthen the work that was happening, to me, partnering with the CDFI made perfect sense. In entering into the industry, I found that while those are the roots, that is the foundation, and many of CDFIs out there have missions that are actually, you can see that that's embedded within the mission. What I found is that a lot seem to have moved towards a practice of driving to be credible with, to stabilize the sector, and in doing that, really adopting frameworks that are more bank-associated frameworks and more, I would say, conventional financial systems in order to, I think part of that is wanting to create a sense of security with funders and investors and really, build from that. But at the same time, what it seems like is there's been a drift away from being community-centered. And I really see the power of CDFIs as being able to intersect between those, is not losing, the credibility in terms of being able to manage the capital and be accredited lenders, and also not having to adhere to the same conventional standards, which have a lot of structural racism embedded within.
Yeah, I've been in the sector for a really long time. And one of the things that has struck me throughout my career is how we, I was a lender for 13 years and within CDFIs. And one of the things that just really struck me is how we have shaped the way we approach credit in the same way that mainstream financial institutions do. So we have a lot of that same language. We look at that from the same framework. And so, as I've been thinking about our work in community vision and thinking a little bit about, how do we approach credit? One of the things that I think a lot about, and I know within the organization where we'll be talking about this too, is that the right framework for us? If we were set up specifically to answer some of those practices, how do we, as you said, how do we continue to be a good steward for capital, and at the same time really look at how are we centering community, how are we making sure that there's the perspective of people who've lived with oppression and violence that's built into the system, being in our decision making. How are we walking away and kind of moving away from a credit structure that really centers mainstream practices and says, how do we think about communities, and how do we think about capital getting into communities, and how do we show up within communities? So I think that's been an important question for me, and it's a really important question for community vision as we think about our work going forward. Carolyn, I wanted to bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit about just the system. We've seen that it's a common refrain that the system is not broken, it was designed this way. And as we're thinking a little bit about change and how are we changing the work that we're doing, can you talk a little bit about how a paradigm shift could support that, how it could support us as an organization and an industry in restructuring systems so that they're effective in building wealth in Black and Brown communities, and maybe talk a little bit about how you're doing your work at the Black Cultural Zone?
Sure. Thank you, Kat. And so I appreciate that question. I also appreciate what Esperanza said and you said about how the work that the CDFI does mimics the traditional banks for many different reasons. And so when we talk about a paradigm, we have to talk about how civilization is organized, how people interact and interrelate with each other. And we have to identify how in this country, and I'll focus on this country, civilization has been organized. When you think about sort of the European colonists who really saw their mission to go out and explore the world and discover. And for them, discovering a new country meant it was theirs. The failure to acknowledge the existing indigenous community was not considered. If you found it, it was yours. But what we really are living on is stolen land. We should take a moment to think about that where we are, the real estate assets we're financing, all of the businesses are on stolen land based on the philosophy that Europeans could come and take what they wanted. So that's one. Second, this country was built with stolen bodies. And so for 400 plus years and more, tools were used, human bodies were used as tools to really generate the tremendous wealth that this country has. And there has to be an acknowledgement of that. And it doesn't mean that you don't own slaves, my grandpa didn't own slaves. We are all need to acknowledge, and that's one of the basic paradigm shifts, and admit where we stand and how we are here. And take a breath. That's the first thing. The second thing is to realize that our system of capitalism and how our economy is built on extraction. And so land and people and bodies are used as tools, which is how, at the end of the day, such wealth is continued to be built. And so to the extent that our capitalism is not democratized, we have workers doing the majority of the work, and the owners of those businesses making not just 10, but hundreds times more than the average wage of a worker. That is modern day extraction. And so again, when we go out as a CDFI and we are investing in property and we're investing in businesses or organizations, how extractive are they? And those are the models that we are recreating. I take a look at all of the missions of all of these amazing CDFIs and CDCs that were formed after the Civil Rights Movement. The intention is there, but grounded in our spirits and our soul and our ways of being is extraction. And we have to change that. So the paradigm shift that has to happen is that honesty, truth, and a willingness to talk about, well, how do I make a loan? I have to underwrite. I have to look for these things in previous financial statements, and they don't have a bank account. And all of those things are then rooted in an extractive system that's based on stolen land and stolen bodies. And so, and people who have been their ability to access wealth and have all of the great financial statements we look for when we underwrite are very hard. If you read things like The Color of Law, you will see that systemically, even after slavery, let's say, was ended, the enslavement of Black bodies and other bodies as well, it wasn't just Black folks who were enslaved in this country. Even those attempts, we talk about Tulsa burning, Wall Street, all of those things, even when these communities are able to eke out anything, it's been destroyed. And that's another thing that we have to be honest about. And we have to really think about, not as someone's pointing a finger at you, but the reality that if there is someone that comes across your plate to underwrite, and their financials are not as stellar, their legacy of the experienced folks on their board, they don't have enough expertise, or they didn't go to the right schools. If you can't change your paradigm and say, well, it would be amazing if they did have all of these things, because every step of the way, every ability to try and gain wealth, access, privilege, education, all of it has been consistently bungled, attacked, massacred. It's impossible. My existence is impossible, but somehow Black and brown communities and other communities, we eke it out. And so how do you then underwrite and support organizations who don't look like that model that we all feel comfortable with, including myself? I'm an investment banker and underwriter, and I am like, balance sheet's got to balance. But at the end of the day, if that's impossible, that the fact that they even made it to your door, how do you then take your frame of mind as to what you expect to see and move it to the side? Because it is really based and rooted in an extractive culture, and we've all been tools in continuing that. So although our missions say the things that we want to say, we are all embedded and wedded in a paradigm that will continue to exploit, continue to diminish communities of color, and continue to make it difficult for them to succeed. And so what are the steps we all have to take in our daily lives, in our business lives, in our organizational lives to say, we must put this paradigm to the left, because everything else that we will do, even this conversation that we're having, simply nibbles at the edges, makes us feel better, makes us feel good that we're trying stuff. But at the end of the day, we've got to start with admitting we're on stolen land built by stolen bodies, and we continue to extract wealth, each and every one of us personally. Yeah. And that's a personal paradigm shift that has to happen first. And no guilt, I'm pointing the finger at myself as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And that's one of the things. So there's a lot of things I kind of want to take off from what you were just saying. But one of the things that we have been doing internally at Community Vision is really working on equity practices and talking about what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for us to be working on stolen land? What does it mean for us to be working in a white supremacist culture, right? So that's upheld through systems that are not necessarily of the individual people's making, but we are still all part and complicit in them, right? And how do we be intentional about thinking about those things and changing them and actively making that shift both personally and professionally? So I wanted to pull out a few things from what you said. There's a conversation there around, like, how are you doing underwriting? How are you working with your clients? There's a conversation about how are you even going into community and acting as partners in community? And then there's also the conversation that we can get into more about internal processes and just what are you acknowledging and how are you doing the work? And I want to talk a little bit about underwriting and underwriting practices first, so we can pull Ruby into the conversation. And Ruby and Kelly, maybe you can both talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing, thinking about conventional financial metrics as being a barrier to community needs, and some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of our practices.
Yeah.
So Ruby, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to talk about lending a little bit in the macro and then get down to the underwriting piece of it. So I wanted to start out by talking about lending, that lending is really still a relational business. So who is in place in order to do the lending is really important. Loans are often placed with organizations that are known entities and within a personal or professional network of people who are in a lending organization. And so that can just cause unequal distribution of loans to particular communities and by default away from other communities. So it's really important that staff is being hired at all levels of an organization, and that not only that they're hired, but that their skills and knowledge, expertise, and networks are being of high value to the organization. But all of that being said, having a diverse staff obviously is not enough in order to make true impact in their communities. And by and large, as has been talked about with the previous panelists already today, is that CDFIs, while we were established to be different than our commercial banking colleagues, a lot of our CDFI underwriting is still steeped in the metrics and a reflection of standard commercial underwriting and banking practices. And that really has to change in order for us to have true impact into the flow of capital to communities of color, and specifically the Black community. So I brought with me 3 examples of how traditional underwriting really misses the mark for Black borrowers. And so the first one I wanted to talk about is appraisals and having an appraisal-based lending system. One of the things that we're exploring is that our appraisals are based on land values that have been systemically depressed and purposefully depressed over the years through things like redlining. They've been undervalued, and that makes it possible or impossible for us for as long as we're using appraisal as like the framework for how much people can borrow against. It depresses the amount that we have available as capital for those communities, and it's really not a fair metric when you could take the same project and put it into a community that was not historically redlined, and they would have access to more capital than the redline neighborhood does. So that's one of the ways we play into inequities that are already within our system. This is not a new concept. IFF does non-appraisal-based lending for real estate, and it's something, and so there are other forerunners, and this is something that Community Vision wants to think about. And also thinking, as you know, whether or not we keep appraisals as part of our underwriting process, one of the things that we need to think about also is what are the other values to that land? And so as we're thinking about, there's the appraised value, but then there are other values, and giving some credit for the historic depression and purposeful depression of those values is important, and giving more access to credit. That's the way to do it. So closely related to that is my second point around loan to value ratios, their LTVs. So as I'm talking about appraisals that are already depressing the amount that we can put into a project. In addition to that, we put an LTV, a loan to value ratio on top of that. And I know that CDFIs traditionally have higher loan to values than our commercial banking colleagues, but they're just still too low and require a fair amount of equity to come in from Black and brown borrowers. And so layering on top of that access to capital. So we know that Black borrowers do not have the same access to intergenerational wealth or additional assets to bring forward as additional collateral. They also tend to lack friends and family capital that can come in as equity, as their equity contribution. And further, it has been documented that Black and Brown led organizations are not given the same level of grant and investment support as white-led organizations. And so you take kind of all of that together, and that LTV becomes a really big deal because they just don't have access to the same level of capital as other of white-led organizations or other organizations that have had more access to assets over generations. And then the last thing is something that Carolyn talked about as well, is experience. We often underwrite based on experience of the borrower, and we take that as a key indicator of whether or not they'll be able to successfully complete a particular project. The issue here again is that Black-led organizations often do not have the specific experience and haven't operated or bought buildings of the specific type that we're underwriting. And so one of the things that we need to start thinking about is expanding what experience means to us. There are different types of experiences that we can definitely count as well as we're thinking about the experience level of a developer. And also pulling in TA and other and consulting, which I'll let Kelly talk about as part of that support system in order to make sure we want to be early lenders in these projects with Black-led organizations. And in the past, this has been a big barrier where if there's just not enough experience there, getting us comfortable with that experience level is a big barrier. And so breaking down that barrier is going to be another really important one. So I'm just presenting these 3 items. I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list, it's not meant to be, but this kind of gives a flavor of what we're thinking about and what we've already identified within our own processes. And what we deem as an industry standard or is actually working against us in our goal to serve Black and Brown communities in this way. So we're joining a number of other CDFIs and to really look at our policies and practices internal and refocusing ourselves from justice on justice and wealth building for communities of color. And in order to do so, we've dedicated ourselves over the next year to look at all of our systems and loan products and operations through the lens of being better partners and being able to better serve the Black community. So in order to do that, we're really deepening our relationships to the community, listening very intently to what is needed and working towards making these types of changes that I've just highlighted. So I'm really excited about what's already been said today and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Ruby. Kelly, I wanted to pull you in and see if you could talk a little bit about some of the work that you do in real estate consulting and the practices there and how that's relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think, where we stand from the consulting department and historically our products and program service delivery model, as it relates specifically to this conversation, and if we're talking about access to capital and specifically to the most underserved and systemically repressed and oppressed communities from a standpoint of that access to capital, we have still very much centered our products and program delivery on the end of the spectrum that requires alignment with those traditional metrics of financial sustainability and resiliency that that Ruby was just talking about. And so that while we do have multiple strategies for for working with organizations to to reach ownership of land and assets, including their different financing mechanisms. We have always been looking to, either traditional financing, whether it be through banks, if that is an opportunity, or CDFIs, which we have recognized through this conversation, are operating through some of those same, the same programs and ways that banks have operated in and that have traditionally left Black and Brown communities out of the access to capital that they need to create their programs. So I think some of the ways that we're thinking of doing that is also of improving that is also looking at the different ways that communities hold wealth and are able to access to build assets and wealth in their communities. And so one of the activities that we've been talking about in collaboration with our own lending department is how do we support potentially emerging CDCs and CLTs in Black communities. And that again is speaking to everything that we've recognized here as really honoring the voices and experiences of the communities that are existing and that we want to be supporting, and just using our expertise as a tool to be able to build the community's capacity, to be able to access capital and build wealth in their communities.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that we're hitting on an important point here, right? So the idea of building wealth and accumulating assets being also a power building and a leadership building sort of model, and really trying to, as we think about refocusing to justice, also really thinking about refocusing specifically and very intentionally on wealth building. And of course, there's a little bit of dissonance here because, as Carolyn started us off talking about how we're all living on stolen land, and then at the same time, talking about land as a primary way to build wealth. But nonetheless, I think that's a really important conversation. And Esperanza, maybe you can talk a little bit about how we've been thinking about power building through the lens of wealth accumulation and ownership.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been looking at, the kind of metrics that we're using, for impact, or that are traditionally used within the CDFI sector around, number of jobs provided, wages, employment standards, versus who's owning the business versus who's owning the real estate that the business is within, and who's really generating wealth off of that. And even then backing up and asking, well, actually, who's driving the decisions around what's being developed in the community, who's making the decisions around even identifying what the problem is. And I think that's where, we need to back up. We need to look at the leadership of whether it's nonprofits or businesses that we're servicing. We need to look at the, executive structure, the composition of boards to really identify that. So because of that, we have developed part of our impact conversation is prioritizing metrics that really speak to that. And so one of our initiatives around Black leadership and power building is creating weighted metrics towards, first and foremost, that leadership is identified as Black. So whether this is a business or a nonprofit, that the leader is Black. And also next to that is ownership of the land. So we're looking at real estate ownership, and we're also looking at after that, transfer of ownership and long-term proprietary rights, and basically looking at who is holding the assets of that business. We have, several metrics following that we are more than happy to share. But I think that in terms of this particular conversation, we really want to focus on, the highest priority for us is really supporting decision makers that are from within the community, so that this can truly be community-led and community-centered, and that, the projects that we're taking on now more than any other time, as we are, in the midst of economic impacts that we don't even know where this is going to land at this point. Nobody knows exactly how this is going to land, with one exception. We do know who's going to suffer the most economically from these inequities. And so knowing that, what can we do to really be a part of solution?
Right.
Yeah, can I add just a little bit to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to add to that the community, like wealth building is all, and the community ownership of land is, just to tease out what you said a little bit, Esperanza, at the end there, is foundational to people's ability to have security of place and to not be displaced. And when we're looking at the communities that are most apt to be displaced during this time, during COVID time, during the Great Recession before that, they are the same communities that were traditionally redlined, and they have a naturally lower cost per unit, cost per square foot than other areas. And so when you're looking in Oakland specifically, which is where a lot of us work and live, is that we're looking at areas in like East Oakland that are going to get hit very hard during this COVID period of time, and as jobs are being lost. And so this to me is like the core strategy of preservation and making sure that people who currently live there can stay there. Where new construction is always great too. I have a housing background, so I talk a lot about housing, but new construction is great too. But as far as like, you have to level that, you have to balance that out with how do you make sure that the people who are currently there have the opportunity to stay there. And I feel like preservation and ownership of land is that tool.
Yeah, I would add a couple things. Before I do that, I do want to let folks know that they can submit a question at any time. So this is very much a conversation, and we definitely want to address questions that attendees have. So please feel free to do that. And wanted to say that, a step further. So it should not be a radical notion to be community-centered, that community development would be community-centered. It is not a radical notion to say that, we should be addressing these inequities. Absolutely not. So, I think a step further that yes, preserving, the current residents, but I think we can also have a conversation around repatriation of historical residents into their communities when we have such clear evidence of displacement due to economic forces and clearly gentrification into those communities. We can have that conversation and ask ourselves how we can be part of that solution and think more creatively around how we apply our resources towards that. I also want to say that, this is very much that shift from a charitable framework around looking at how do we provide, support crisis services and strike a balance between crisis services. Now, during, the COVID pandemic, we are in a crisis, right? We are in a public health crisis. So there are services that need support on an ongoing basis. I think there's been a lot of work towards charitable organizations that provide relief to poverty versus actually looking at systemic change to eliminate that poverty in the first place. So I think, again, CDFIs were created specifically to address systemic issues that were leading to inequities, right? So I think it is upon us. It is literally our duty and the reason that we were formed to address that. So I just wanted to, put that in there around thinking creatively, and that these are not radical notions.
Yeah, and I would like to say that we have to look at, CDFIs have to look at the influence and power that it has. If they're truly committed to equity, I always tell folks, I just look at the numbers. And at the end of the day, when we look at our staff, our board, our clients, and all those folks, what does it look like? And if it doesn't look like equity, then we know it when we see it, and we have to figure out ways to address it. I think we also have influence when we invest and lend to different organizations that have privilege, that have all their numbers together and have all those things. What are we requiring that they do? Are we requiring that they partner with some other group, not in an extractive way, to really help build them up? Are we requiring that they address how they gentrify their neighborhoods and what plans do they have in place? How do we really think about the impact of the programs and projects that we're funding, and where we can use that lever to connect them to groups that may need the leg up or may need a partnership and emerging programs? The other thing is the other directional way with our investors. Have we, they invest the money, they get the return, you got to pay it back. Why is it a loan in the first place? You've made billions of dollars and we're getting a loan. But also, what are we requiring of our investors? Who are they? What does your organization look like? You can check off potentially a box, but what's your staffing like? What's your board like? What are your extractive processes like? And how can you do something to change? They will listen. And I think we have to use that voice and that power and that influence with the folks who invest in us, and asking them to take a look at themselves, the folks we invest in, and asking them to look at themselves as well as to actually do something versus talk about it, and really taking a hard look on a month-to-month, quarter basis as the numbers. The numbers, as Kat taught me, never lie. If you don't have more Black faces and brown faces and locations being supported, then we are a part of the problem. Whether we want to be or not, we are part of the problem. And we need, again, back to the paradigm shift, we have to really, really shift how we think about the work that we do completely, because 40 years of history of the CDFIs have shown, or 30, that we have not been as successful as we should be and we are furthering the tradition of extraction and theft in this country. And I know that's not what we want to do.
No, that's absolutely not what we want to do, and why this conversation is so important. So can I tease out a couple of things from what you just said there, Carolyn, and then I see that we're getting some questions in from the attendees, so we'll go to those as well. I just think it's interesting. So we've been within the organization, we've been working on a small grant program, and we've been talking about how do we get that out into the community, and it's attached to our Black Leadership and Power Building Initiative. And it's been an interesting discussion, right? Because instead of just saying, okay, we know some organizations and you know, we know they need some capital and maybe we'll make these grants, we've been having a real discussion about how, so a lot of things you just talked about, Carolyn, like who are we talking to? Are we only talking to the same organizations that, you know, that are on everybody's radar, that are getting money over and over again? Or are we thinking really seriously and intentionally about who are the young people? Who are the emerging organizations? Who are the organizations that are doing really great work, but for one reason or another aren't part of the sort of in-network, or, you know, for ourselves or for foundations or what have you? And how do we be really intentional in making those relationships come to mind? And then secondly, you know, and this was a point that you made to me the other day, Carolyn, is if we are putting money into a community, particularly if it's something like a grant, and we are giving that to a Black-led organization, but the question becomes, is it then going to recycle and stay within the community? So thinking deeper than just that first step. But, you know, is that organization, if part of that money is going to be used for consultants, will those consultants be part of the community? And how are we just thinking about not just what is our initial work and like, gosh, we got a grant out, but like, how is that money really reverberating into community? And I think that that's an important point for all of us to be considering as we think about how we do our work, and just to get away from the idea of being totally transactional, but that the work that we are doing, getting back to what many of you have said, is really about partnerships and really being sort of having a depth of thought about how capital goes into communities and how it stays there. So wanted to point that out. And then I wanted to, there's a couple of questions that have come in from attendees, and one of them is, what are some examples of where this new paradigm has been successful? And so I'm going to open that up. I'm going to suggest that one of the organizations that I've looked to quite a bit that has a loan fund is actually Mandela Marketplace here in Oakland, because they are doing work that really is, they have a loan fund. They make loans to very community-focused businesses that are working in food for the most part, but they have a very different approach to their work around underwriting. It does not look anything like what we would call mainstream or traditional underwriting, and they've been really successful with that. Similarly, Inclusive Action down in LA has a lot of very similar approaches to their work. They have a loan fund where they're working with mobile vendors in Los Angeles, and their work is also very different than what I would say is a traditional mainstream financial system or even mainstream sort of CDFI approach. So wanted to throw that question out to other folks as well to see if all of you had other folks you would want to suggest looking at.
Not in terms of CDFIs, but I think in general, the collective, cooperative, collaborative models work of ownership, investment, management, and operation. When you can democratize access and involvement, it always is a better thing. I think also looking at making sure you maintain a rational distinction between the earnings of the highest paid anything, worker, investor, and the lowest paid worker and investor. And doing things to make sure that we guarantee a minimum income are absolutely critical. People deserve to not have to work 7 jobs and to have health care. I mean, I was talking with a friend of mine who's got Medicaid now, and their child is going to get all of their teeth capped, but they won't cover anesthesia. So you want her little child to get teeth capped and no anesthesia. It's things like that that just drive me nuts. But in terms of examples, I love East Bay Prec Permanent Real Estate Collective and how they're trying to do ownership. I love any of the cooperatives that are out there, and how do we really push the cooperative and the democratization of wealth and access is also important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also like to share. I personally recently read an article or a research paper that was actually published by the Urban Institute, where they looked specifically at race, gender, and equity within community development institutions. And they spoke to a cohort of CDFIs that are led by people of color and serve people of color. Those tend to stay small. They're local, but they tend to be limited in size because they tend to also struggle against financial discrimination in acquiring investment and acquiring funding for their own CDFIs. However, their models are highly effective. So in terms of, it's really actually not a new paradigm. There are many organizations and CDFIs that have been doing this and doing it effectively. Kat mentioned some, Inclusive Action and Mandela Partners. There are some that are even more longstanding than that are highly effective. We just don't hear much about the work, and I don't think it gets lifted up as much in this industry. But the paper that I would highly recommend that folks check out also really does map out, some of the effective strategies that those organizations have used. And I think really what you see is an interview of 15, well-known CDFIs out there who are saying that we have, as an industry, missed the mark, that we do need to make this change and we need to make it now, and that there are very practical, realistic steps that we can take both internally and externally to address that. And that, again, it is actually our duty as CDFIs to make that happen. So there's a resource that I would encourage folks to check out. And I don't think I can post it in this, but we will follow up with it.
Yeah, and that's the paper was written by Nancy Andrews. Right. Kelly, are there examples within the real estate world that you occupy that you would like to lift up as examples of things that you just think work really well and speak to these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, these are all things that we're researching right now and that we're trying to identify, what would be the best models for us to, to be able to lift up some of these issues that we're seeing in communities. Definitely East Bay Prac, as Carolyn mentioned, and also, I know in partnership with Ruby and Lending, we've been doing some outreach to, as I mentioned, some emerging, I should have called out CDCs as community development corporations and CLTs as community land trusts. We've been doing some outreach to those that have been existing in the communities for a long time, and that maybe just haven't been able to get very much deals off the ground, and also new CDCs and CLTs that are also emerging from the communities in new collaborative ways, cooperative ways, and non-traditional ways. And so I think right now it's sort of an information collecting stage that we're doing and trying to see how we might be able to plug into that to be a real authentic and true partner with those organizations.
Right.
I'll just add a little bit to that about the emerging CDCs and CLTs, and the network that exists in the Bay Area. And we're trying to also do work that isn't in the Bay Area, that's out in the Central Valley, which is another one of our core geographies. But that there are these groups, and I think that this has been there's a real gap in education and training, specifically geared towards these smaller and emerging groups that are coming up in communities all over the Bay Area. So we know of them in Oakland, we know of them in Richmond and Vallejo and East Palo Alto. There's a number of them getting started right now. And it's so important for us to be an early partner in those efforts. It's completely aligned with what we're trying to do, and thinking about the strategy as a more holistic strategy, which includes both thinking about, like what resources we're able to bring to the table. So if there's grant and loan resources there, and also TA that's available through our group. And so that's something that I think is a really exciting opportunity for us to continue to build on as, and we're not, as a collective for community vision. And we're not the only ones working on this. There's also an effort for Black-led developers specifically. And so there's ways that as we go deep into community, as we really get involved and talk to people, there are so many ways to collaborate that I'm seeing as possibilities. in the near future that I'm pretty excited about what we can build there. And then as far as the appraisal thing, I do want to lift up IFF again, who's been doing this for 20 years, I think, the non-appraisal. So that is an existing framework that is out there that people have been doing, and they're doing well with it. And there's a Shelter Force article about it that we can share out to, along with the report that Esperanza mentioned.
Ruby, I think the work that you're talking about is particularly, it's always important, but is particularly important now as we are, as you and others have referenced, going to be seeing as the economy changes, and there's going to be a real focus on buying up land in communities of color. And so how are we as an institution supporting those organizations, those people, those land trusts that can be in a position to really have community ownership of community assets? Because, you know, I think what we saw in the last economic crisis was a lot of change of ownership and gentrification and external investors and predominantly white investors coming in and buying land in communities of color. And so this is a really fraught and important time. And one of the reasons is we've been doing this work, we think that those are really important models for us to be thinking about, both long-term and then short-term and sort of the urgent, immediate, near future.
Can I add just one more thing before we move on? About, like, I wanted to lift up a little bit and just put a spotlight on what Carolyn said earlier about joint venturing and making sure that those relationships with the possible joint ventures, because one of these things is building the experience, right? And the joint ventures tend to be, I'll take, like, not only extractive, but exploitive, in my opinion. And so how do we really make sure that those joint venture partnerships are healthy and that they are allowing for capacity building, like true capacity building, so people have the experience that they need to be able to move forward. So that's what we want to avoid, that old model of joint venturing and quote unquote support.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's really important as well. So we had a question from the audience. It's asking us to unpack a little bit, for those who might be unfamiliar with Mandela Partners or Inclusive Action, a little bit about the work that they do. So first of all, I'll encourage everybody to go check out their work and their websites. You know, we don't want to represent their work. It is very much their work. I think we can talk a little bit about it, but they are just really great examples, and you can get more information on the web about them. We can talk a little bit about what they do, and one of the questions was, you know, do they function on the ground, and sort of how do they do that? And I can talk a bit about that, and Esperanza, if you want to chime in as well, but I also would just really encourage people to go check them out directly, because they are doing really, really important work, and I think that they are someone that we want to lift up but don't want to speak for directly. But my experience with Mandela Partners is that they just have a very different way of approaching the notion of underwriting. So instead of looking at sort of the traditional C's of credit, you know, they instead are looking at alternative forms of capital. So they're thinking about sort of relational capital and societal capital and resilience capital as well. So who is the person in the community? How are they connected to the community? What is their plan? How does it resonate in the community? And looking at that kind of work instead of just what do the numbers say? What is the traditional collateral? What's our traditional loan to value? And I think that that's a really important framework, particularly as an organization that is grounded in a specific community. Similarly, Inclusive Action, which is down in Los Angeles, they have come out of work where they've been working with mobile vendors, and it is not just lending, right? So they are doing all sorts of support for mobile vendors. They've been really allied with the policy work that's been going on in Los Angeles about legalizing mobile vending work, which I think is another aspect of things that we should be talking about here, which is how are we aligned with policy, because capital and expertise are one thing, but there's another whole part of this conversation around policy. But similarly at Inclusive Action, you know, they are, again, really thinking about like who is the person within the community and how does that play into their decisions around credit. And Esperanza, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that. But again, I really want to encourage people to go check them out independently.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I would just mention that one of the ways in which this is being done actually across the state and actually nationally, now that I think about it, is through their collaborative, Inclusive Action and Medela Partners also collaborate across California. They have a national partnership that they're developing called Equitable Food-Oriented Development, where they're employing these approaches specifically to, redefining return on investment, redefining, credit structures and analysis. And also, as you mentioned, Kat, redefining what is that loan to value and how do you account for the tremendous amount of service and capital that comes out of social capital and navigational capital, and how do you weave that into the actual end value of the work specifically that CDFIs do in partnership with the community.
So we have a few more questions here. Well, I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything there. Okay, sorry. But here's a question from the audience is, can you give examples of how community vision is involved in preservation as opposed to new construction that doesn't disenfranchise existing community residents? And Ruby, maybe I could throw that over to you to start.
Yeah, I mean, so we have been participants in the City of San Francisco Small Sites Program, and also a regional preservation effort that's going on all over the Bay Area. So what that means is we lend to nonprofits who acquire buildings that are already occupied by existing residents, and normally they're very low income residents, in order to make sure, so backing up, these are all called NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, and I don't love that nomenclature, but they're naturally occurring, meaning they're market rate, they're not restricted housing units. And so what that does is take those buildings off the speculative market, and then because they've all got city and county financing in them, or some type of government financing, they become permanently restricted properties. And so what that means is that all of the residents who are normally very low income, either working or senior residents, can stay there for as long as they want. And then whatever units are empty when it's purchased can get filled also with lower income residents from the city through a lottery process. So that's kind of one methodology of preservation that takes those units off of the speculative market. It doesn't necessarily turn into ownership opportunities for all of the tenants, and I don't know if that's kind of where that question was going, but it's possible. So when you have a group like Oakland CLT, we financed their Liberated 23rd building I think it's in the Fruitvale. But part of their long-term plan is to have that building be co-op owned and managed. And so there are opportunities. Just because it's a nonprofit who acquires the building doesn't mean that has to be the long-term sort of like management structure or ownership structure for the building. But what is important is that somebody has the capital available to them in order to acquire the buildings at haste. They have to acquire them quickly to be able to get them off the speculative market and beat out the investors that are out there. That step has to happen first, and oftentimes that is not something that like the residents are able to do on their own. I'm not saying that that's not always, sometimes that is the case, the residents have those resources available to them, but oftentimes there's this intermediary step.
Thanks. Did anyone want to add anything to that? I know that there are other organizations that are doing similar work around, and I think we all hate the term naturally occurring affordable housing. EBALTC in Oakland is doing some of that work too, which we've done some financing for as well.
And East Bay Prec.
And East Bay Prec. Yeah. Great, thank you. So did anybody else have anything they wanted to add to that before I move on? Okay.
Sorry, Kat. I did. I just wanted to highlight, especially as Ruby was just mentioning, the Oak CLT's project Liberated 23rd is that, in addition to small sites that's being used for predominantly housing, that we can also focus these efforts in commercial real estate and in stabilizing traditionally we have worked with in consulting at least with just nonprofits, and we can work with stabilizing and preserving the nonprofits in place, but we are definitely considering and looking at what does a holistic community preservation action look like, and what does that include outside of potentially nonprofits. But just highlighting that, our activities have also been able to support existing nonprofits and communities to understand and how to structure themselves, again, within sort of the traditional framework of commercial real estate as it exists today, and what we've been talking about, but definitely looking at alternative ways that organizations have been able to access and capital and stabilization of space through things like community land trust and other vehicles that are available today. But,
Thanks. I think
we're working as well.
That's a really important point, Kelly, is that I think when folks think about preservation and keeping existing community residents, they automatically think of housing. And so lifting up the idea of commercial real estate is really important as well, particularly, as you all know, and for the folks watching, we are involved, Community Vision is involved with some small business lending too, specifically thinking about how to build wealth in Black and Brown communities, including the Real People's Fund, which we work with several partners and act as the loan administrator for, that's really thinking about businesses and small businesses. And so taking a holistic approach to community, I think, is really important as we think about that. And commercial real estate, as we know, is as endangered to the speculative market as the residential one. So thinking about the community as a whole is a really important point. So I want to go back to some of the other questions that have been sent to us. Also want to kind of note when we're talking a little bit about investors and investment and kind of that large scale and investors coming in and buying property, I think we're talking about both institutional and then sort of the companies and folks like that have been doing some flipping in communities, and just kind of want to clarify that because there had been a question from the audience around that. So Esperanza, you touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can go into some more detail. There had been a question around traditionally the CDFI industry focusing on sort of collecting information that has to do with number of units and number of square feet of community facilities and other indicators of that nature that are really outputs and not necessarily impact or outcomes. And so how are you in strategic initiatives and working with our impact folks thinking about impact and assessing what aligned impact looks like? And I'd be curious for you to talk a little bit about that. And Carolyn, you may be thinking about that as well from either your seat in the work that you're doing or as a board member. So maybe you can join in that conversation too.
Yeah. So at Community Vision, one of the ways that we've been doing that was first kind of modeling impact metrics different than our social impact rating tool that we've been using within the organization. We were testing it out in our program FreshWorks in order to identify new strategies that we could use that were effective for our resources within the community. And that was, to address inequities within the food system. So after 3 years of doing that and really utilizing also a scorecard method, which is helping us to orient around mission before we actually move into the resources, we can identify projects that are high priority and high impact. And so we, as I mentioned earlier, rather than just looking at metrics of jobs, we definitely have an economic development and jobs section of our scorecard because, of course, that is still important. We also have included aspects around equity, which are looking at, who owns the land, who owns the business, who is really driving the asset and generating wealth off of it. This is, with FreshWorks, and also we are mirroring this and other metrics within the Black Leadership and Power Building initiative, because we're really looking at an overall theory of change. The simplest way of putting it is, you know, how can we change a system if the very people impacted by that system, the people impacted by inequities within that system are not leaders, do not have a voice to change that system? So, you know, we're looking at how do we cultivate and strengthen the voice of people so that they can be those leaders, you know, whether the folks who are running businesses, the entrepreneurs out there that are so motivated and so focused that they are fighting against the odds to lead a business, to lead an initiative, they are community leaders. And so we want to look to their wisdom and look to support them in that, again, to strengthen their voice. So, you know, I think the metrics that we're looking at definitely are accounting for that. We've also been looking at other aspects of, you know, having metrics around how do we identify that someone is community centered? You know, who are the partners that they are connected to? What is the ecosystem that they're operating in? Are they themselves from that community? Are there high levels of trust and confidence of partners that are doing work effectively within the community? So we're including that. I'm trying to think of and looking at our score sheet to see there are so many, I don't want to just read them off. We're also looking at metrics that include training. So in the case of leadership, you know, who is training that next generation of leaders? Who's providing training or, you know, receiving training for business capacity? Yeah, I think, you know, in addition to looking at supporting leadership and supporting ownership, we're also defining equity, as I mentioned earlier, looking at who, you know, is a historical resident and who's being, you know, prioritized. We see a project that is supporting a historical resident as being higher impact. So those are some of the shifts in our metrics. Away from, you know, just conventional. We are continuing to collect data, but I do want to say this in itself, which is actually also derived out of our strategic plan. I saw a question about that from someone who worked on the team of consultants that developed our current strategic plan, that, you know, prior to 2019, Community Vision actually didn't collect data around who the nonprofit leaders were that we were supporting, right? And it wasn't until we moved into this plan and really lifted up economic and racial equity that we started collecting that data. I think that in itself, and that, you know, is not an unusual industry practice. And also, I want to lift up how much information, you know, we've left a complete hole, and as an organization didn't even see that we needed to be collecting that, or that should be considered one of the impact metrics. So, you know, again, I'm looking forward to really sharing the scorecard and our information with other CDFIs. And yeah, like I said, without going into greater minutia around it, I'm happy to answer any questions regarding that.
I think the other thing that I'd just point out is important with that is when we have been developing these metrics, we've not been doing them in a vacuum. So part of the process of developing scorecards is to talk internally, certainly, and have a conversation there, but then to also really try to vet the scorecards with folks from the community, so have a community input, which I think has been a really important part of the process and an important change for us too, right? So we are not suggesting that we are the absolute experts on what we should be measuring, but instead saying, here's our best thinking on it. And now, you know, can we go to our community partners and get their input as well? Because, you know, that, Esperanza, to your point, right? If we had not even been tracking who the executive director was of the organization, you know, we're clearly going to have our blind spots. And even as we are thinking intentionally around this, getting back to that idea of centering community, is if we are designing these things with community input in mind and with bringing those community perspectives in, we are going to be more successful in serving the community. And CJ, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Just quickly, I mean, I think it's important to really hold a symbolic seat at this table and all tables and all conversations for the most disenfranchised person that you can visualize, and really understanding who that person is, what their challenges are. And even with this conversation, I think about, I just won't describe it, but I think about the most disenfranchised person I know, and the conversation is above their head. And at the end of the day, they are trying to understand, how do I eat? How do I survive? How do I take care of my family? How do I have options? And so we always should think about maintaining a symbolic seat when you do your scorecards and your job descriptions and all those things. How does it work for the person who's most disenfranchised? I think the other thing that the Black Cultural Zone does in terms of how our model is really to be a non-hierarchical organization so that all voices can be heard, to really push and promote, again, cooperative and collaborative. So all voices are heard. There's no consensus necessarily, but at some point you have to allow folks to live their best life, bring their whole self to the work, and to really have power in their positions to make decisions and to make change. And so we do that in our organization. We do that as we try to incubate businesses and hubs, et cetera, and try to promote that. But I also want to talk a little bit about just what does it mean to be, I'm just going to pick a Black business, and I talk to friends I know, being a Black owner of a business is great, but our goal is not to create more Black billionaires. Our goal is to elevate the income level of the community. And so what that means is how many Black folks are, for instance, hired in your business. What do your vendors look like? What do their employees look like? You know, what are their vendors like? And so you really do have to go deep. No one is there yet, because if we had deep sort of economic sort of recycling of dollars in the Black community, none of us would have a job. We would not be having these conversations. So how do we go to a place where we build the circulation of dollars within a disenfranchised community, local communities, and how do we support that? And so just remember in all of your conversations, even in your thoughts at home, as you go through this pandemic and this turbulent time, hold a seat, a symbolic seat for the most disenfranchised person you can imagine, and try to look at your conversations and your thoughts and your actions from that perspective.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that we talk about, you know, at Community Vision, and I think really does need to be lifted up, is accountability. So that as we speak to this work, as we speak to it externally, as we speak to it within the organization, that we hold ourselves and others accountable to it. And so I think absolutely, Carolyn, what you are saying, and this, imagine, you know, that you're walking directly through the community and you speak directly to that individual. What are you really doing for them? You know, like, what are you doing to change their situation? Again, not so much the relief services so that they can be, you know, have the relief deep within their poverty, but what are you doing to change that poverty? And how would you speak to them about that? So I think having that level of accountability. I'd also like to mention a book called Unapologetic by Charlene Carruthers that really does talk about, you know, that if you ask a person who is doing work within community development, how are you personally invested in this? How are you impacted by the inequities? And they say they are not. That, you know, you have to ask yourself, like, how invested are you yourself if you're not doing this because you're not feeling directly impacted? How do you know what it feels like? How do you empathize with that individual that you said is most systemically disadvantaged, is really suffering the consequences of biased systems?
Thanks. Carolyn, I think, first of all, I think that's an incredibly important point. And as we are thinking about our work going forward, accountability is becoming more and more of a key aspect of our work, right? So it's been something that we've been really sort of lifting up throughout our strategic plan, getting back to one of our strategic plan members being in the, team members being in the audience. But it is going to be the thing that allows us to really look into the faces of our community partners and say, this is what we're doing, is holding ourselves accountable and being able to be able to do that at a staff level, at a board level. I mean, I think that's another important point to make, right? So it's not just us individually working, but at a board level as well. And how is our organization sort of integrating that into all of our conversations? And that maybe between that and Carolyn, you talking a little bit about the structure of the Black Cultural Zone, wanted to bring up a question around why is it important for institutions to examine their internal cultures and practices and not just the work externally. So we've been talking a lot about what the work externally needs to look like and what we are committing to doing and how we're kind of changing our external practices. But want to talk a little bit about why is it important for that to be mirrored, that work to be mirrored internally as well. And Carolyn, you're nodding along, so I can throw that over to you to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, culture isn't made up of the people, the structures, the artifacts, and all of the elements that make us who we are. And I think about the concept of a lot of the statues that really elevate Confederate soldiers and why they're coming down. Those are artifacts that really bespeak something that is horrible to one group and lauded by another. And so the culture has elevated those artifacts as something to be looked up to. And until we address the culture, which tends to be by the dominant society, and address that culture really can stymie people, silence people, impact people, make spaces unhospitable for them to participate in, then we don't have full participation. And so the culture is created by individuals, and we are steeped again in stolen land, stolen people, and the raising up of a particular paradigm that we're just used to. It's fed to us in commercials and movies and all of these things, and promoting wealth and riches and all of those things. And that is our culture. And it's a culture that is not working. It's a culture that cannot be sustained. And unless we change the culture of our country and within each organization, those two will not be sustainable. So how do we shift the culture? You have to shift practices, policies, procedures, artifacts, elements, ideas, concepts, pictures, visuals, symbolism, imagery, all of those things have to change. But I just want to share that it may feel to some folks that this is really too much. I had a conversation with a woman about Mary Poppins and how she loved Mary Poppins, and now some story in Mary Poppins is being held up as being racist, and she was emotional. And we have to empathize for a group of folks who have for so long lived in a culture that they didn't know maybe was wrong or not right, and they are also losing things as we have lost so much. And so we have to be empathetic that it's a slow process, but it's a necessary process that has to happen, and that it is not a limited pie, that we can actually be a better country, a better organization, a better civilization. If we make room for more, we'll all do better. And we just have to work with each other and adjust, because changing culture is painful for a lot of folks that are used to it. So it's not an easy conversation, but I always just quote to folks, what if it were you? What if it was your child? What if it was someone that you really cared about? And what would you do differently? I fight for my child, and I want people to fight for us. And that's why you change culture, because you care as if it were your own.
I can't say that any better, Carolyn. Thank you. But I think I wanted to just add, sort of from my perspective, one of the reasons why we have to do the internal work is to show up authentically. So just adding that word to the number of words that you threw out, Carolyn, I think that for us to be authentically in community and saying that we want to do these kind of culture shifts externally, we have to also be walking the talk internally. And it is a hard process, and just to acknowledge that there's a lot of individual work, there's organizational work, there's institutional work, there's systemic work that has to happen. And it can feel like a huge wall. It is a huge wall. It's going to take time for us to slowly kind of peel the layers of that onion back. But it's so important for each of us to be engaging and leaning into it, and leaning into the discomfort. And the only way through is through. We have to walk through all of that pain that we're all experiencing right now, and to get to that other side and have those authentic conversations and be vulnerable together.
Ruby, you said to me the other day, why wouldn't we all want to build a culture that lifts up every person's genius, internal genius, right? And that really resonated with me quite a bit, because it was, again, we can think about the work that we're doing externally, but until we are at a position where we are respecting and lifting up every person's internal genius, their genius internally, we are not, even if you just wanted to come at it from not even a culture, but a good business practice, right? Like, why would you lose the value that every person brings to the conversation? And so, I think that's one of the things as I'm thinking about culture internally, that really resonated for me is like, what is that culture that we are building and continuing to build, and how do we center that in terms of the valuing of every single person?
Can I just say one more thing too around language? And I know there's a whole sort of, we don't want to be PC, but sometimes thinking about how others feel about what you say is not a bad thing. I mean, this is America. We have a First Amendment rights and all that, and we can say whatever, but sometimes just really thinking about, and I always think about, I hear a lot on the news, well, this is a dark day. Wow, and so think about people who are dark, how constantly you are fed that dark, black, all of those things are the bad things. Now it may sound about being PC, but again, you can shush people like us into silence around even the language and say, oh, that PC thing, or the other thing, you know, when people say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Well, of course it does. Of course it does. But the point is that sometimes people have to think about taking a step back so others can take a step forward. We can go back into silence and we will continue down the path that we're going. But until you really holistically, and know that I understand when people, well, all lives matter, and I don't mean anything when I say it's a dark day, but take a moment to take a breath and think about even the language that you use and how many decades that Black or dark people have had to even listen to everything that is negative being described as Black and dark. I'm sharing this with you, but there's a lot of that goes on in the community, and it's time for people in the dominant culture to listen and to recognize how we've had to navigate a world that has been constantly negative about who I look like. You all know me, but I can walk down the street and everything that I represent still to this day is negative. I don't feel that way, but this is the world that we navigate. And the ability of Black people, brown people, to even get through all of that, to get to a place where they're got themselves together, got an organization and a loan, and they come in and you say, well, where's your financials? And where's your this? And where's your that? And where's your this? It can break someone's spirit. That's not our intention, but know that when they get to our door, it took a lot to get there. Not that we're better or more or worse, but because of who you look like, most folks don't have to deal with that when they come to your door. So I just want to remind folks of that. Language.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. And I think that one of the things that we are thinking about internally is how much of a sort of a white dominant culture, like what are the practices and how is the organization built on white dominant culture, and how do we dismantle that? And there's a lot of things that, you know, just as a white person that I don't even see, that I, you know, that I have to say, like, oh gosh, you know, I really have to be intentional about thinking about it. And the point being not to sit in fear of that, but instead to say it's more important to see it, understand it, and change it than to not want to admit the problem. And I think that's incredibly important. And as we think about all the ways that we want to do this work internally, holding that is incredibly important. All right, so we have only a few minutes left. I've been told that our webinar might in fact kick out directly at 11:30, so I think we probably want to wind up just a little bit beforehand so we're not mid-sentence. And we, I think, have answered most of the questions that have come up from the audience, except for, I'll briefly just say there's been a question about would we be willing to share the Black Leadership and Power Building Scorecard. And Esperanza, maybe you could talk a little bit about both that and some of the work that we're doing around, you know, bringing both ourselves into this work, but then wanting to partner with other CDFIs and other partners in community development around Black leadership and power building as well.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And so the short answer is yes, we're more than happy to share that. The other aspect of this is a whole initiative, and actually, you know, part of this work, as we've been talking about how do we shift, you know, standard practices, we cannot do that in a vacuum. That requires partnership with our stakeholders. And so, you know, we actually want to invite all of you. This is very much, you know, we have to take action now. These are pressing issues happening now. So we invite you to partner with us and to actually prioritize, you know, Black leadership and power building with us. And so we will be following up and reaching out with exactly how you can do that. You know, we're launching a campaign to invite you to participate, to identify the metrics that you will be held accountable to as you move forward in that path. But we invite our fellow CDFIs, we invite other financial institutions, our institutional investors, our individual investors. We invite all of you to join us in prioritizing. And we will most definitely, as part of that, share with you, you know, what we've determined as being high priority impacts in this initiative.
I think the one thing we'd want to add to that is we know that we are not the first here. So there are, while we are saying that community development in general and CDFIs specifically have work to do here, we also know that there have been CDFIs that have been working for decades in Black communities that are Black-led. There are CDFIs that are led by people of color that are working in their individual communities that have really been doing this work and showing up this way for years and decades. And so this is an invitation, you know, this is an acknowledgement of those organizations and those people that have been doing the work, and an invitation to other organizations like Community Vision that are really thinking about how do we do more and do better to join us in this work. Okay, so I will see if anybody has anything else they want to leave our folks with who've been attending. If anybody has any final last words that they want to offer. We've all talked a lot. Okay, so to the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking in this conversation. We know this was a little different than maybe what you had expected from the first invitation, but we think this is an incredibly important conversation. It's hugely important for us in terms of the priority of the work that we are doing. We know that we have a lot to think about in terms of what the work that we've done to date and how we can be much more successful. We're taking that very seriously. And we would like to invite all of you, whether you are another CDFI, whether you're one of our individual investors, whether you're one of our institutional investors, our partners, to go on this journey along with us, to think a bit about how, you know, as particularly a capital source, how you might be showing up as well. We encourage you to check out all the organizations that we've been referencing throughout the day today, because there are definitely a lot of people who are doing this work out there in the community as well. And please reach out to any of us. We're happy to answer additional questions to continue the conversation because it's an important one. So thank you very much. Take care.